Bill Benson has been one of the most important freedom pioneers of the 20th century. Since the early 80s, he has single-handedly driven a powerful wedge into the presumed validity of the federal income tax and the IRS. He'll tell you the story of his extensive research trip to the capital cities of all 48 states to assemble the evidence that the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was never ratified. His 17,000 certified notarized documents present incontrovertible legal proof that the income tax and the IRS have no basis in law. He's persisted in his crusade in spite of great pressure against him, enduring severe treatment in federal prison and ignoring all attempts to call him off by threat or bribe. His story is both shocking and inspiring. I'm joined in my interview with him here by Claudia Hermer.
What I'd like to start with is the history of how you got involved in this research regarding the 16th Amendment.
I was a former investigator for the Criminal Investigation Division for the Illinois Department of Revenue. And in that position, it was my duty and responsibility to collect the excise tax, not the direct tax. There was a great deal of corruption that went on within that department. And we had one case that was worth $3 million. And the attorneys for the state sold that case and settled that case for $250,000. That ruffled my feathers, and I went to the director of the Department of Revenue, and he said, "Bill, why don't you just shut your mouth and take the money like everyone else does? Take the envelope, let him put it in your car, let him put it at the table when you're having lunch or wherever. But remain silent." I tell him, "I'm sorry, I wasn't raised that way, nor do I intend to do it. You have the wrong guy for the job if you want me to take money and to take bribes. No, thank you." He said, "If you don't remain silent, I shall fire you." I said, "You might as well do it like yesterday, because if you do, the day you fire me, I shall sue you for violation of First Amendment rights." And we both kept our word. The director of the Illinois Department of Revenue fired me, and I then sued him. I had an attorney in Chicago, and just myself, the two of us, worked against the largest law firms in the city of Chicago. It took us 6.5 years to get into court before a jury of 6 in a civil case. The jury found in my favor and awarded me $350,000 for violation of First Amendment rights and for the dismissal and firing of me from my position. That was back in the 1970s.
What led to the research regarding the 16th Amendment?
When I was fired, I never say dismissed because I was fired, and I did sue and I did win. I began to work with the attorney that had my case. We had an income tax case in the state of Indiana. It was a willful failure to file case. We had about 300 pages of documentation that I obtained from a man by the name of Martin Beckman. Martin Beckman got that documentation from a man by the name of Dean Hirsch from Cheyenne, Wyoming. Dean had called the various secretaries of state, written them letters, asking them for the research work on the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The answer came back from the various states that we are not going to do your legal research. If you want it, come to the states and get it. Dean didn't go to the states and get it, nor did Martin Beckman. During the course of the trial, we made an attempt to use the 300 pages that I purchased from Martin Beckman. Beckman got the documentation from Dean Hirsch, copied it, put it in file folders with the name of the states on each file folder. There was only one state that caught my eye, and that was the state of Kentucky. On February the 8th of 1910, on page 487 of the Senate Journal, the Senate was in session, and they were voting on the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution. There were 9 senators that voted for the amendment and 22 that voted against. I asked the attorney, because I was sitting at the conference table with him as a paralegal, to make sure that we try to get this documentation before the court let the jury see it, and we did that. We had Martin Beckman come in from Billings, Montana, to testify in that case as far as the documents that he obtained. He never told us that he got the documentation from Dean Hirsch. I didn't find that out till a long time later, probably a couple of years or so later. The judge said that the thing that we needed to make our case was that documentation must be certified, it must be notarized, and you must have a witness to testify to. Mr. Beckman was not a witness to testify to because he did not do the work. So the judge permitted Mr. Beckman to testify, but then he struck his testimony, and when he finished testifying, he then ordered him removed from the courtroom. And, of course, the documentation was not entered into evidence, nor was it seen by the jury. The jury deliberated in that case for about 45 minutes and found the defendant guilty of willful failure to file a tax return. And after that case was concluded, we had dinner that evening, and I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, the judge has given us our marching orders. The only thing we have to do is go to all 48 states and get the documentation certified and notarized. And the attorney says, Bill, you're crazy. You can't do that. I says, of course, we can go to all 48 states, but we have to find the funds that will support a project like that. It was very fortunate for us that there was a man by the name of George Sitka, who I wrote about in Volume 1 of The Law That Never Was, because George called and said, do you mind if I come to Chicago and talk to you about what you want to do? I said, not at all. When George arrived in Chicago within a couple days, he said, how come you're not on the road like now? I said, George, we lack funds. He said, you have an open checkbook. He said, so now you can get on the road like tomorrow. I said, no, it'll take a couple of weeks, but if we have an open checkbook, I'm on my way. And that's what started the year-long study to all 48 state capitals. I went to each and every capital, researching the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution in every phase that I could find in every book that was available to me at that time. And after I had completed 27 states, I knew that there was a very, very serious problem. Of course, I knew that before, because not one state out of the 27 that I had looked at to begin with, not one had ratified the amendment. In one way or the other, they all made changes. Capitalization, punctuation, wording. They did not agree with the wishes of the Congress of the United States, so they changed the amendment. And that is something they do not have the authority nor the power to do. There was a memorandum that I found at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. that was drafted by a man by the name of Ruben Clark on February the 15th of 1913. And Ruben Clark pointed out the discrepancies, the errors of what the states had done. He told Philander Chase Knox, who was the Secretary of State, that the states had not ratified. Philander Chase Knox went ahead anyhow, even though he had the certified notarized documents that came back from the states showing that they did not agree with the wishes of Congress. And on February the 25th of 1913, he signed a proclamation stating that the 16th Amendment had been ratified by all of the states, including the state of Kentucky, when very clearly on its face you can see that 9 will never become greater than 22. Believe me, I can't wait until I get back into court or have the IRS indict me or Commissioner Rossetti indict me or someone in the federal government indict me, and put one of the federal judges on the witness stand that I know very well and ask him, when in your wildest dreams or comprehension will 9 ever become greater than 22? You explain that to the jury. If you can get that by, then I'll file a tax return, but not until.
Well, Bill, how many of these certified documents do you have?
I have 17,000 certified notarized documents. There's probably a little bit in excess of, but when I went to trial, I had to give a copy of that documentation to the prosecutors and to the judge. I personally made all 34,000 copies on my own copy machine because you've got to be extremely careful with the certified notarized documents. If you break the ribbon, if you cut the ribbon, or if the seal is dislodged, then the documentation is no longer useful. It is worthless. You have to go back to the state and do the work all over again. The documents have to be notarized. They're certified to begin with when the Secretary of State sends to the governor of each and every state the 16th Amendment, as in this case, or any other amendment. When he sends that to the various states, the governor calls the General Assembly into session and tells them that the United States Congress would like them to adopt the 16th Amendment or whatever amendment is before them. And the only thing that they can do is to vote with the yay, with the nay, with the yes, with the no, and that is all. Otherwise, we would have 48 different versions of the law. Which one should we go by?
Okay, so you now have these 17,000 to 18,000 certified documents in your possession.
They are in my possession, yes. And they're ready to go in court anytime anyone indicts me or indicts anyone else that I might represent in one way or the other, because there is a reliance defense program that I prepared in 1993. And since that time to this day, no one has had a problem after they've brought a large box of material to the IRS, which is a 14 by 14 by 14 box that weighs 43 pounds. They're all government records, government documents, government material. It isn't anything that I've really written or drafted. It's what the government has done.
So just to clarify, the Reliance Defense Program becomes appropriate when a person has gotten into some kind of dispute with the IRS and they explain their actions, their reason for non-filing or whatever the action they chose, in terms of relying on the information contained within those documents which are furnished in that box. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. But the one thing that cannot happen is if the documentation is brought before the court, the government, the prosecutors, will file what's called a motion in limine, precluding us from using that documentation. So what I did was I circumvented that situation, and when an individual gets a letter from the IRS, whether it's an audit letter, whether it's a 515, 518, 520, no matter what it is, whether it's a telephone call, a knock on the door, that documentation then goes to the Internal Revenue Service. And I take out of that large box, Volume 1, Volume 2, 4 3-ring binders that contain all of the documentation from the National Archives in Washington, and present it to the district consul, who is usually at the meetings, or the revenue agent who is there. It's an exhibit, and they are made thoroughly aware of the fact that if anything happens to this case any further, if you carry it on any further, then we will expect you to come into court and testify about the documentation that has just been presented to you. Because when I take out each piece of documentation, I will give a little bit of history as far as the documentation is concerned.
So, Bill, you've gone with many clients to the IRS offices. You've presented your boxes. Can you tell us what kind of response you've gotten back from the agents that you present this to?
Well, yes, I can. There was an agent in Florida who I happened to go before once, and I have a document prepared that the agents sign showing that they have accepted the documents, and that document has everything that's in the box. One of the most important things that I do is to bring along a certified, notarized court reporter, not a little tape recorder. So now we have a transcript of everything that was said and everything that was done. The agent in Florida accepted the documentation after about 2 hours, and was probably about 7-8 months later that I had to go back to that very same agent. When he walked into the room and saw me sitting at the conference table with a box, he said, "Oh, S." And blank, blank. He says, "Not you again." He says, "I know what the box is all about, Bill." He says, "Give me the document that you want me to sign." And he says, "You can be out of here quicker than you were last time."
So when people see you coming, they already know what's in that box, and nobody has pursued it into the courtroom. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
Now, Bill, from what I understand, once you accumulated these certified documents, the government became very interested in the book you were about to publish. From what I understand, you received a phone call from somebody. Can you explain what that phone call was about and what was offered to you not to publish that book?
Yes. The phone call was initiated to our home to begin with. I was in Birmingham, Alabama, giving lectures. Volume 1 hadn't been printed yet. It hadn't hit the streets yet. And there was a man by the name of Warren Richardson that called Mrs. Benson and said it's an absolute emergency that Bill call Washington, D.C. immediately. He says, "I'm making this call on behalf of Senator Orin Hatch." And he said, "Of course you know him." And she says, "No." She says, "I know of him, but I don't know him." Now, the beauty part about this conversation, and the one that ensued with me, was the fact that there was a Baptist preacher on the other end of that line, and his name was Dr. Greg Dixon. When I called home and received the message, I told Mrs. Benson that when I finished my lecturing, then I would call Washington and not until, because I didn't have any emergencies there that I knew of. I finally got to them, and I talked to Warren Richardson and Dr. Dixon. They both said that they were on the line. Warren Richardson said the very same thing to me. He said, "I am making this call on the behalf of Senator Orin Hatch." And he says, "Of course you know him." And my answer was the same as Mrs. Benson's. "No, I don't know him. I know of him." He said, "Bill," he said, "the thing that you cannot do, absolutely cannot do, is to permit that book to get into the hands of the kooks out there." I said, "I'll agree with you that we have a degree of kooks in the private sector, but the majority of the kooks are in Washington, D.C., and I now name you president of that kook club." He said, "I don't think you quite understand what I'm trying to get at." He said, "You have all of the books printed that you want." And he said, "You name the number of books, and then you put a price on the books, and we will pay it." He didn't say, "I will pay it." He said, "We will pay it." And I told him, "You go to hell. I'm not for sale. America is not for sale. I couldn't be bribed when I was with the Department of Revenue, and I can't be bribed now." And he said, "Don't you understand?" He said, "You will be a multi-millionaire." But he said, "There are a couple of things that we want. We never, ever again want you to speak to any one person, to a group of people, never to get on radio, to get on television." And he says, "Oh, yes. The last thing is we want all 17,000 certified notarized documents." And again, I said, "Warren, you go to hell." He was amazed that I would not accept his offer. Later on, I found out that Warren Richardson was a lobbyist. He told me that he was, and Mrs. Benson, an attorney working for Senator Orrin Hatch, making the calls on behalf of Senator Orin Hatch and working with him. I never knew he was a lobbyist, probably for 15 years later. After some 15 years, Warren Richardson wrote a very complimentary letter to me, telling me what a credit I am to our country, what a fantastic job that I have done. During the telephone conversation with Greg Dixon and Warren Richardson, when that call was concluded, Pastor Dixon had called me about 5 minutes after, and he said, "Bill, if I had known that man were going to offer you a bribe, I would have never been on this telephone call." And Pastor Dixon has drafted an affidavit that anyone can see. It'll be on my website very shortly. Warren Richardson's letter is on my website, and so will the affidavit be.
What would happen when this goes into the courtroom and a case is won? What would that mean to the American people regarding the 16th Amendment never being ratified? What would the government have to do?
The government would have to stop collecting taxes from each and every individual. I challenge the government at every place I go. I tell everyone that I, Bill Benson, absolutely, completely refuse to file a 1040 tax return under our present taxing system. I'll not permit this federal government to make me a criminal, because under 18 U.S.C. 1001, I would become an accessory after the fact to the criminal act that Philandro Knox committed back in 1913, because it was a fraudulent act. And fraud vitiates every contract from its inception. It is null and void. So the very second that Philandro Knox signed that document on February the 25th of 1913, it was null and void. When that pen left the paper, it was null and void. No one ever dreamed that some almost 75 years later, someone would travel to each and every of the 48 continental United States capitals and research the documentation. Come home ready to fight federal government with 17,000 certified notarized documents. Not too many months ago, we were in Washington, D.C. and had what was called a walk around the IRS building. The walk around started at the Jefferson Memorial, and we walked around the IRS building chanting, "Show me the law, show me the law." When I got behind the podium and had the mic, I challenged Commissioner Rossetti. Come and get me, Rossetti. No one else wants to do it. You're the boss. You do it. You have the power. You do it. I said, but first you have to get by this. And I held up volume 1 of The Law That Never Was. You have to get by this book first. And then you have to get by the 17,000 certified notarized documents. Anytime you're ready and willing to take the witness stand and you want to indict me, I'll have all 17,000 documents sitting there and we'll go through them one by one, including volume 1 and 2.
Well, Bill, how do you address the question that many people will come and say, well, the 16th Amendment is beyond review? There's cases out there that people have actually brought in one-year volumes, for example. How do you address the fact that they're saying, oh, the 16th Amendment is beyond review?
Fraud. They have to remember, a fraudulent act. It just wipes out every contract. If someone would have a problem all the way back to 1913, I could still say, okay, he's not filing the tax return because you don't have a law. Show and prove to me and to us, to the American people, that you have a law from its inception. And this is where a lot of people have made a very serious mistake. They haven't gone to the inception of the law.
And also, really, your entire package is necessary, not just one of your volumes, somebody going in there on his own, trying to tell a judge, I read Bill Benson's book. That is not what your program is about. Is that correct?
See, I explained that if you do that, the government's going to file what's called a motion in limine. The judge is going to grant it, and you won't be able to use the book. You've got to do it correctly, and you do need the entire program, the entire 16th Amendment Reliance Defense Program that I developed in 1993. And when that is taken before the IRS, Believe me, it is the most powerful thing that has ever been taken to them. Because of the work that I've done, we now have 2 that I know of, probably 3, and I think there's a 4th coming along. One for sure, a CID agent who has resigned because they would not answer his questions about this issue. He said, how can I carry my handcuffs? How can I carry my service revolver? How can I have my bulletproof vest in the trunk of my car and all the equipment that I need? How can I take anyone's property when I know now as an IRS agent there is no law for me to do it? And he resigned.
In the course of trying to get this information considered, I've heard that different people at different times have attempted to bring this in front of either the Supreme Court or the Congress, and it's been passed back and forth like a kind of hot potato. So can you explain or tell us a little of the history of that and where it stands now?
It is a hot potato. No one wants to address it. If any individual would stand on the steps of the IRS building and challenge a commissioner, because we had a podium set up, we had mics set up, we had loudspeakers set up, and challenge a commissioner, show us where we're wrong, prove to us that we're wrong. And Commissioner Rossetti wouldn't even come out to speak to us. At one time, he was going to, because I told one of the fellows that we were with, I said, take a note up to the guard and see if he will talk to 3 of us. Because there were 500 people there, 600 people at that session. And I said, see if he will talk to 3 of us. So the guard took the note, took it to Commissioner Rossetti. It took him 20 minutes to come back. And he said, no, put it in formal writing. Now that just doesn't make sense. Here you have a man challenging him in open view before the public. Come and get me, indict me. And he refuses to do it. I haven't received a letter. I don't receive the 1040 booklets that everyone gets every year. I don't receive any of that. And it's all because of the 16th Amendment issue.
To get back to this specific game that's played, where if you take it through the court system to the Supreme Court or try to get Congress to talk about it, neither one will deal with it. This is alarming and problematic, and it involves a lot of people in collusion to be able to avoid looking at this. It's not just the head of the IRS.
One of the major problems is that you have to go through the district court, the appellate court, if you lose, and then the bank panel, and then file a certiorari to the Supreme Court and see if they will hear you. The Supreme Court, so far, everyone is ducking this issue. There's a very good reason, very good common sense reason, because they have fraudulently taken people's money for 80 years, taken their homes, their cars, put them in prison. They've done everything that they can to people. And when this comes out, and if they would concede that, okay, Bill, you're right, your book is right, you'd have so many lawsuits filed against the federal government, I don't think they could ever get out from underneath it. I tried to tell people, to encourage them, no, don't file a lawsuit. Let's stop it now. Let's just get rid of it now. Yeah, we've all paid a price. We've all suffered in one way or another, but let's stop it now. We've been to Washington now 8 times, invited the commissioner, the Congress, the Department of Justice, everyone. Formal letters were sent to them. They refused to show up. Even at a meeting that is held in Washington, they refuse to show up.
Now, why is it that also there's been so little coverage of this in the media and the press so that so few people know that this has been happening?
You see, one of the things that happens here is that the Congress and the IRS are playing the good guy, bad guy part like any police officer in any city, any town, any state would play in a squad car, unmarked car, whatever. One guy's a good guy, one guy's a bad guy. Congress can stop this tomorrow, period, without the IRS saying anything. They have no power. It is the Congress of the United States that is really at fault. And I believe that's why we're seeing a lot of rumble right now as far as we've got to do something about this. Senator Traficant was before the floor of the House, and he said the IRS is nothing but a bunch of stumbling, bumbling nincompoops, and we've got to get rid of them. They've got to go. Never ever before have we heard senators or Congress coming out with language like that. They simply haven't done it. But today they are. I think it'd probably take another year, maybe two. I doubt if it's going to be two. But one of the things people have to do is stand together. I watch documentaries on television like everyone else does, and one that I'll never ever forget is the march that Dr. Martin Luther King had on Washington. When he said, we are going to get our civil rights, we're going to march peacefully to Washington. Those black people dropped everything and anything they had to do. I don't care if they had to go to work. I don't care what they had to do. You saw the throngs of people in Washington, D.C. When are we going to wake up and do that very same thing? That is what has to happen. And this income tax will go. But it's a fear that government has now of being sued. Mm-hmm. They know the wrong that they've done to so many people.
Well, Bill, how do you answer the question when people say, well, if we don't pay income tax, what would support the country we live in?
The federal government, right now, as I'm speaking, has $37 trillion in surplus money. And I have those books at home. The state of Illinois has $4.8 trillion in surplus money. Now, how do you get surplus money? By overtaxing. Stop the taxing. $37.7 trillion? Good Lord, the interest on that money will keep this government going from now until doomsday.
And isn't it true the IRS costs so much money just to keep it running? Basically, they're a collection agency. Is that correct? A collection agency for the Federal Reserve to collect taxes. But the cost just for the IRS alone is costing taxpayers tremendous amounts of their tax dollars. Is that correct?
Just for them to open the doors, it costs them billions of dollars to just open the doors without collecting anything. President Reagan had a man by the name of J. Peter Grace do a study on the waste and abuse in federal government. If you remember the $600 toilet seats, the $400 hammers, well, it was J. Peter Grace that uncovered all that. J. Peter Grace had the authority to go into anyone's desk, anyone's office, with the exception of the IRS. He couldn't go there and see where the waste and abuse was. And he wrote a 8-page letter to President Reagan and told him in that letter that not one nickel of the personal income tax goes to support any of the agencies of federal government or anything that federal government does. It goes for nothing but to reduce the interest on the national debt.
Isn't it true? A lot of people are thinking, what about the roads we drive on, the schools our children go to? Isn't it the personal tax and the sales tax and the excise tax that pays for those things?
That's exactly correct. There's a lot of people that simply don't understand the taxing authority, how it works, who builds the roads. And, of course, federal government does. They help. But it comes from your gasoline tax. When you go to the gasoline station and start to pump gasoline in your car, you don't have to sign under the penalty of perjury, but you're still paying a sales tax. You're paying an excise tax. And I believe that's the thing that Congress is trying to implement now is an excise tax. I don't believe they'll get away with it, but that's what they're trying to do.
And Bill, isn't it true here you are openly confessing you do not pay personal income tax, yet what do you receive every month from the government?
I'm 75 years old, and I do receive a Social Security check. There isn't any question about that. I don't feel guilty about taking it because I worked for that money. I mean, that was money that I paid into. even though the federal government paid into it too. There's a lot of people that will say, well, I'm going to rescind my Social Security. I'm going to rescind this, rescind that. Some people at 64, 65 years old, they want to go ahead and rescind their Social Security when they have this money coming to them. It's your money. Take it.
From here on in, if you could write the resolution, the end of the movie, the way you'd like to see it go, what would it look like?
I believe that the end of the movie would be we would have a country that would prosper and grow so quickly overnight, it would be absolutely unbelievable. And you would have peace and harmony in this country because the big battles in this country are with the IRS. I mean, the IRS is a gangster government, and I have no qualms about calling them a bunch of gangsters because that's what they are. Because I have documents from GAO that show that the IRS agents steal money. One agent in Washington stole $569,000 in one check. That check legally belonged to a taxpayer. And he made sure that the check went to his home, so he was able to cash it. And when he did, and when his paperwork started to come back through the IRS, he got rid of all the paperwork. And there was a lady in Chicago that it took them 10 years to catch up to her. She had stolen $269,000. That's only the very, very tip of the iceberg. I mean, they're all involved.
What do you see unfolding in order to get to that prosperous country that you just described? What are the steps that would happen from where we are to the dissolution of the problem and the beginning of the new possibility?
There's going to have to be a meeting of the minds with the people like me that are fighting this issue, with people like the IRS agents that have resigned. There has to be a meeting of the minds with the Congress of the United States and with the Department of Justice and the IRS. You have to have a common road someplace. We have to have a starting place. And we've tried to do that in Washington. 8 times we've been in Washington, and 8 times we have been ignored. But believe me, we're going to be back there a 9th time, and a 10th time, and 11th if we have to. In 1987, I sent to the entire Congress of the United States, Volume 1 and 2. First, I send the books back to my printer to have the congressman or congresswoman's name embossed on the bottom of the book like the book is outlined in gold, and had UPS hand-deliver it to each and every member of Congress. And I got a lot of letters back, a lot of favorable letters back. I sent Volume 1 and 2 to 1,158 judges in this country, the United States attorneys, from the president all the way down. I sent them Volume 1 and 2. Last year, there were 60 million people that refused to file a tax return. I'm waiting for the figure to come out for this year. I'll bet you it's well over 100 million, without a question of a doubt.
So the educational effort has been and is being quite successful.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So it's really just a matter of time.
It's a matter of time. It's a matter of time to where a group of congressmen or a group of senators will say, okay, enough is enough. How much more do we have to fight?
At this stage in the process, what support can further the results that we all want to see?
I think that by writing letters to Congress, by saying to the Internal Revenue Service, no. What part of no don't you understand? Even though the courts have decided they don't want to listen to it, you can't keep something like this under wraps. They've done it for 80 years. It's out in the open now. So you might as well go ahead and concede. Someone's going to have to concede. I think the thing that they're really waiting for is for me to pass on. But with the people that are coming aboard now, like IRS agents, that to me is a credit. I feel very pleased about that. So if anything happens to me, the IRS agents or any number of people can go ahead and take up this fight right now, because the 17,000 documents are still going to be available. I have 4 children, and they are all very well aware of what Father does all the time. They are behind him 100%. I have a 10-year-old granddaughter who has been graded in the 3rd and 4th grade as the smartest 3rd and 4th grader in the state of Michigan, and they want to skip her several grades. And so far we haven't let her do that. Northwest University is testing Brittany, and Brittany is reading volume 1 and 2 and asking me a lot of questions about it. So here we have a 10-year-old that will take this fight up.
Now, Bill, you talked about the gold seal and the blue ribbon. Can you explain what process each of these documents has to go through?
Yes. To begin with, the Congress of the United States, when they want the states to ratify an amendment, they have to send a certified, notarized document to the governor of the state. The governor will then call the General Assembly into session, and then the governor will tell them and read to them, and then they are asked to accept or reject, no more, no less. In the 16-page memorandum that I found in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., it said, further, under the provision of the Constitution, a legislator is not authorized to alter in any way the amendment as proposed by Congress. So when I would go to a state to get a document certified and notarized, I have to get the documents from whatever journal I'm looking at. I have to peg the pages and then take it to the Secretary of State's office. And then they put the blue ribbon, the gold seal, like on the Kentucky document. If I were to go ahead and make an attempt to just copy the documents myself or anyone, you cannot do it. It's not legal. The Secretary of State must do it from the peg pages that you have.
So that helps me understand why he's called the Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Because it's a secretarial job in this case.
Right.
Make a copy of this, please.
Now, Bill, how do you answer questions? You have spent some time in prison, and people are coming to conclusions that you spent time in prison because of not paying taxes based on the 16th Amendment argument. Can you explain your story about going to prison?
Of course. To begin with, the 16th Amendment issue was not argued at the district level in my case. If you'll remember, I told you that if you take the documentation into court, and we did that, we brought 17,000 certified notarized documents, 17,000 for the judge, 17,000 for the prosecutor, and we had a big dolly to wheel all those boxes up into the courtroom. The documentation that I brought into court in my case, when the government indicted me for the year of 1980 and 1981, because they said that I had worked for an insurance company and I had received $110,000 from that insurance company. Well, that was a settlement from the insurance company, like I won my case before the Department of Revenue, because the insurance company did not represent me as an agent in 8 cases. We had 8 pending cases where my partner and I made the arrest. And because I blew the whistle on the Department of Revenue, they would not represent me. So I had to go out and hire an attorney and do most of the work myself to begin with. And the insurance company wound up paying me $110,000 as a settlement. The insurance agent went to the grand jury and testified that I worked for his company, that the $110,000 was income. And when we got him on the witness stand, my attorney said, "We have asked you to bring all of his records from your company." We want to know how much vacation time he has coming. We want to see his personnel record. Where is it at? And the attorney said, need I ask the question back or should I have the court reporter read it back? So he raised his head and he says, no, I lied when I testified before the grand jury. And that's in the transcript. There isn't any way anyone can get by that. The judge, after hearing that, ushered the jury out of the room immediately. We had about a 4 to 5 hour battle then with the government and with the jury. And the judge says, well, this case is going to go ahead anyhow. Maybe he lied and maybe he didn't. And there wasn't any way that we were going to change that judge's mind. After a 5.5-week jury trial, the jury found me guilty on that $110,000. I spent 15 months and 5 days in prison at FMC Rochester in Minnesota. And I take medication, since the 1960s because I was infected with encephalitis. When I got into the institution, they put me in the hospital section. And I said, what am I doing here? Why not general population? They said, no, this is where you're going to stay. So they took my medication away, and I said, you can't do that, because if you do, I'm going to have problems. I'm going to have seizure problems. And they said, we're going to change your medication. We're going to give you what we think is best for you. I said, no, you're not. But I had 4 guards that came in, 1 on each leg, 1 on each arm, and 3 nurses, 2 across my midsection and 1 with the needle. And that was La La Land. Believe me, that was La La Land. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I couldn't talk, I couldn't walk. That put me in a wheelchair for 2 years. My prison time, I guess, went by quickly because I didn't know anything for a long time. Mrs. Benson got a telephone call from one of the inmates and said, you better get into this institution because we believe they're trying to kill Bill. So she did. I was only there 6 days, and the warden wasn't going to let her see me. And she put up a big battle with the warden. And finally, there were 2 nurses that had to wheel me down from the hospital. I was covered with bed sheets. My body had swollen up with edema, probably 3 times the size as it is right now. Our daughter then was 38 years old. I didn't know her. I couldn't see her and talk to them. No. What she did was get on the telephone when she got back home. A lot of people formed what they call a telephone tree and blocked all of the telephone lines coming into the prison because people would be calling the prison every minute, so no lines, nobody could get in or out. And then they started to write to the Congress. They said, what are you trying to do? Kill Bill Benson because he authored a couple books on the 16th Amendment? After they had received in excess of 100 letters from members of Congress, they then decided, after one congressman said, what do we have to do? Send in an investigating team in there to find out what you're doing with that man? Then they finally stopped the over-medication. They put me back on the same medication I came in the hospital on, but the damage was done. They had to wheel me wherever I went. I couldn't move the wheels on the wheelchair. It was about 9 months before I really started to come to. The inmates, there were 3 of them that said, we're going to bring you out of this. And of course, they told me that later because I didn't understand what they were doing. They used to hold cards in my hand. You can see it. You can see it. You can do it every day, as many hours as they could do. And then it would take me up to the gym and have me hold dumbbells if I couldn't hold them. Little by little by little, it was the inmates that brought me back. And when I did come back, I thought, wait a minute, I'm in a wheelchair and I can't get to one of my favorite places, and that's a library because it's on the 4th floor. I was very familiar with the Uniform Standard Accessibility Act enacted by Congress. I had a friend of mine on the outside. I said, John, send me the books. And I got 2 sets of them. And I took them to the warden, and I said, I want to get to the library, and I'm going to get to the library because the Uniform Standard Accessibility Act says I can go anywhere that anyone else can go in this institution, even though I am a federal prisoner. So now what you have to do is you have to build ramps from the bottom floor up to the 4th floor. The inmates named those ramps the Benson Drives. Then it was one thing after the other after the other. It was the Italian people like to play bocce ball. And they said, well, Bill, how about getting this done for us, getting new bocce ball courts for us? I said, well, I'll give it a try. So I went to the warden and I said, I can't play bocce ball with this wheelchair. I want you to build bocce ball courts for handicapped people. And he built 3. And I said, by the way, fix the others for the other inmates so you don't have a complaint from them. See, my mind is starting to gel now. The legal aspect of me is coming back. And I said, wait a minute. FOIA says that I can have the name and the address and the grade of pay and the salary of every employee in this institution. And I want it. So when I went to the office to get it, they said, we're not giving you that. I said, if you don't give it to me, then you might as well take a bed next to mine, because now you become a criminal. It took about a month and a half, and I got a stack of papers, 3/4 of a foot tall, with the name, the address, the grade of pay, and everything about the employees. One sergeant came up to me and he says, what the hell do you care how much money I make? I said, well, quite frankly, I really don't. I don't think I've even read it yet because I can't quite see enough to read it yet. So it was making the law work for you on the inside. The law still works for inmates on the inside as well as it does on the outside when they put you in there. There are things that they can do to you and things that they cannot do. And if you know a little bit about the law, there's a whole lot that you can get done. So at least I made my mark in that institution. There was about 5 inmates that went to the warden when I was leaving and said, we would like Bill to come back and visit us. He says, I never want to see that man in this prison again. And the reason I was leaving is because the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals had said that Judge Paul Plunkett had abused his discretion in permitting the testimony to go on the way he did by the IRS agents, that they had tainted the minds of the jurors. And the government's case was weak at its best. And the chief and key witnesses for the government, their testimony was open to very serious question. We must reverse Benson, period. And out I came. That really hurt federal government. They didn't like that. Because now I'm out. Now I'm talking about 16th Amendment again. So I learned a great deal. And I think that I helped a lot of people in that institution. It was an education for me, winding up in prison because you authored a couple of books, mostly because you beat the state out of a big lawsuit, and they didn't like that.
So, Bill, are you saying that your case was reversed?
My case was reversed, absolutely reversed, yes.
Bill, in terms of that case being reversed, has that in any way helped anyone else coming after you to keep them out of that trouble? The fact that you went ahead and dealt with it and worked it through and reversed it?
I think it does help when I go to the IRS office, yeah, because they know who I am. There isn't any question about it. Now, when I can bring a former IRS agent in with me, and I've done that in a couple cases, yeah, they don't like that either. And so they'll leave the individual alone.
But when a case is reversed, does it stay on the books? Is it something that other attorneys can refer to or use as a precedent, or does it just disappear?
It's reversed, yeah.
So it's there
Sure.
and reversed, and
And
that
it's there and
stands as the
reversed,
record.
Yeah. One of the things that happened during the course of my trial is that the court said, what about Mr. Dickstein's statement that there was language in the case that says this question of the 16th Amendment has not been developed? We don't have a record on it, and I refuse to allow him to create a record on it. What about that issue? Mr. Stone, who was the prosecutor, Well, the 16th Amendment issue wasn't adjudicated in this case because it wasn't a proper defense. It had nothing whatsoever to do with why taxes weren't paid in 1980 and 1981. Mr. Benson, by his own testimony, his remarks again today, said his research began in 1984 and he wrote his book in 1985. And he even says, if you can believe him, he went into it with an open mind. And then the court says, but that's not the point. The point is, if his thesis is correct, there was no law to violate. The judge also makes several other interesting comments. He says, I believe that his book, The Law That Never Was, which I have read, that puts that judge on a witness stand in any case, is the work of a man who investigated the 16th Amendment and came to certain conclusions about it and wrote a book about it. And I do not consider that in this case as any mark against Mr. Benson. If it's not a mark against me, it's not a mark against anyone. I am ignoring that to the extent that it's somehow supposed to reflect badly on him. In fact, I think if it does anything, it makes an argument for him. Once again, if it makes an argument for me, it makes an argument for everyone. Because free speech in this country is protected. And when the day arrives when it isn't, we will not have a United States of America, at least as we know it. He is a person who has convictions and believes in them and speaks out about them. And I hope the day doesn't come when we punish people for doing that. And right after saying that, that hypocrite put me in prison for 4 years.
You actually read that from a court transcript.
That is a transcript, yeah. What the judge really meant and what he said when he said that was he knew that we were dealing with an issue of fraud. And if there is no law to violate for me, there is no law to violate for anyone. And this is part of the documentation that I read when I go into the IRS and present a case with a potential defendant.
It's very exciting. And we'd like to thank you for the amazing work that you've done in bringing this to light so that we can all carry it forward with you.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you.